Hey everyone. Tonight's episode is about a strange but familiar habit. The way our minds replay old conversations, or imagine future ones that may never happen. We think of the perfect comeback. We rewrite the past. We anticipate conflict that never comes. Maybe it started with something small. Someone corrected you in public, in front of someone important. You smiled and nodded, but hours later your mind was still spiraling, replaying all the better ways you could have responded, calmly, confidently, with just enough wit to reclaim your voice. But why does the mind do this? What is it trying to protect? If you enjoy these calm, slow-moving explorations, feel free to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to hear in the comments. What kinds of arguments or conversations does your mind revisit at night? And what do you think you're really trying to say? Let your breath slow. Let the day loosen its grip. This is Sleep Tight Psychology, night stories for the thinking mind. Relaxing psychology to fall asleep to. You're lying in bed, finally still, the lights low, the outside world softening into silence, and then, without warning, a voice returns. Not from the room, but from memory. A sentence someone said to you, a tone that felt sharp, an awkward pause you wish you'd filled better. And just like that, the quiet moment is crowded again, this time with a private audience. You, them, and the version of you who always knows what to say now. Maybe it was a conversation from today, or 5 years ago. It doesn't seem to matter. Your mind starts pressing play, then rewind, then play again, like it's rewatching a scene in a film it can't stop editing. Maybe you've done this too. You hear your old response. You cringe. You replace it. You add that perfect comeback, the clever retort, the calm boundary you wish you'd set. There's a strange comfort in this mental theater, a sense of agency, even power, as if reimagining the moment might change something. But of course, it doesn't. The scene stays the same in the world. It only shifts in your inner world, where the brain quietly rescripts what it couldn't control. This isn't weakness. It's actually how memory works. The human brain is a storyteller, and it rarely tells the same story twice. Each time we revisit a conversation, we don't just recall it. We recreate it. We soften what was too hard, sharpen what was unclear. We give our past selves the tools we didn't have back then, and in doing so, offer ourselves a strange kind of comfort. What's especially curious is how convincing these revisions feel. You can almost believe the moment really went that way. That you did speak up or didn't overreact, or found just the right words to soothe the rising tension. The memory, once fixed, becomes fluid. And it happens so quietly, maybe while you're brushing your teeth, or standing in the shower, or walking home under the soft orange glow of street lamps. The original words drift back, and your mind gently starts to adjust the scene, not out of vanity or denial, but out of something more tender, a longing to feel more whole, more aligned with who you believe you are or want to be. Maybe the moment passed too fast. Maybe it startled you, and now replaying it is like holding it still, just long enough to understand it better. Sometimes it's not about changing what was said, but noticing what wasn't, the thing you wish you could have explained, the sentence you silenced, the fear that crept in and took your voice. The internal loop isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's grief. The grief of a moment that didn't land the way you hoped, a kindness misread, a boundary missed, a joke that fell flat. And so the scene returns, not to punish you, but to soothe you, by letting you make it right, if only in your imagination. I've definitely done this after interviews, or long car rides, even years later. It's not about obsessing. It's about unfinished emotion, like the mind is still trying to make peace with a moment that left a mark, one that didn't quite resolve, one that tugs at your thoughts like a loose thread. You pull at it, not to unravel the past, but to understand the shape of what it could have been. This rehearsal isn't failure. It's your brain trying to reconcile the emotional tone of an encounter, like tuning an instrument that felt slightly out of pitch. In many ways, your memory is a dialogue between then and now, between who you were and who you've become. And in that quiet interplay, the story evolves. You become both the narrator and the editor. It can feel exhausting, yes, but it's also an act of care. Because inside the replays, there's often a deeper message. I care about how I show up. I care about the people I speak to. I care about the stories I carry. And sometimes you need to revisit a memory more than once to hear what it was really trying to tell you. Maybe you've noticed that these loops tend to appear when things are still, when the noise fades, when no one is asking anything of you, when the only voice you can hear is your own. It's like a hallway that opens only at night. You walk down it slowly, not because you're lost, but because your mind is curious, trying to retrieve something it missed, a detail, a feeling, a truth that slipped past you the first time. And so you return, not to punish yourself, but to stay close to something that mattered, even if it's messy, even if it never changes. The loop is a form of emotional continuity, your brain keeping the thread of the story alive, hoping that someday you'll understand why that moment mattered, not because of what was said, but because of how it made you feel, the discomfort, the longing, the confusion, the regret. These are echoes, and echoes always return for a reason, not to haunt, but to be heard. And sometimes the loop keeps returning because there's still a part of you inside that moment, a version of yourself frozen in time, still holding a feeling that never fully thawed. It could be embarrassment, it could be shame, it could even be love, the unspoken kind, the kind you didn't know how to name at the time. So the mind goes back, not to fix the moment, but to find you in it, to comfort the part of you that wasn't ready then. You may be older now, wiser, but your nervous system doesn't age in the same way. It holds emotional memory like a soft imprint on fabric, stretched, faded, but still there. So each time you revisit that old conversation, you may not be trying to win it. You may be trying to hold it differently, more kindly, with less judgment, with more compassion for who you were when it happened. Maybe this is what healing actually looks like, not forgetting the scene, but telling it again with a softer voice. Maybe you haven't even had the conversation yet, but your mind already has, and not just once, dozens of times. It begins so quietly. Maybe you're doing something simple, folding towels, staring out the window, driving the same road you've driven 100 times before. Then, out of nowhere, you're inside a conversation that hasn't happened. A future moment begins to unfold, not in real time, but in your imagination. Vivid, sharp, emotionally charged. It might be with someone you love, or someone who unsettles you, a coworker, a sibling, a stranger on the internet, and suddenly, you're responding, defending yourself, explaining, justifying, confronting, all in your head. But it feels real. because in so many ways it is. The mind is rehearsing, not for performance, but for protection. You've probably noticed how detailed these imagined arguments can get. The dialogue, the facial expressions, the way their eyebrows raise when they challenge you, the way you stay composed this time. Not flustered, not scrambling. You say what needs to be said. You make your point. You stand your ground. It's compelling, addictive even. Because in these imaginary scenarios, you are prepared, you are powerful, you are calm. These rehearsals are not fantasy in the way daydreams are. They're not rooted in hope, but in defense. And that's why they stir something so deep. You might feel your jaw tighten, your stomach clench. You might not move a muscle, but inside, your body is preparing, responding to a threat that doesn't yet exist. The nervous system doesn't wait for confirmation. If the brain believes something might happen, something emotionally significant, it starts running drills, like a fire department doing exercises in an empty building. And sometimes it helps. You walk into a real conversation more composed because you've been there already, at least in your mind. But more often, these rehearsals don't lead to calm. They lead to fatigue, because the fight keeps happening inside you, over and over, and yet no resolution comes. You spend hours in invisible conflict, only to step into the real world feeling worn out by a battle no one else can see. Maybe this sounds familiar. The script you write in your head again and again, as if refining it will save you from ever needing to use it. There's a strange kind of safety in that. A feeling that if you rehearse it enough, you won't be caught off guard, that you won't be embarrassed, that you'll finally be able to say all the things you wish you could say, without your voice shaking. And that belief, that preparation equals protection, is rooted in something ancient. Long before modern language or offices or group chats, our ancestors had to navigate conflict as a matter of survival. Social rejection could mean real danger. Being misunderstood, misaligned, outcast. Those were risks the brain learned to fear. And that fear still lives in us, hidden beneath modern anxieties. So when you anticipate the fight, even one that's unlikely or distant, your brain is simply trying to protect your place in the world. It's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. You've felt the sting of being dismissed before. You've had moments where your voice didn't come out right, or didn't come out at all. You remember how it felt to walk away from a conversation and immediately feel that ache of, I should have said. And so the mind prepares, not to escalate, but to prevent that helplessness, to be ready next time, even if next time never comes. You're not alone in this. You're not strange or dramatic or overly sensitive. You're just human. The emotional realness of these rehearsals is a side effect of how deeply we long to be understood. It's not about controlling others. It's about avoiding the pain of feeling invisible. And yes, it can feel like a strange use of mental energy, arguing with a person who isn't in the room, preparing for a confrontation that may never happen. But the mind doesn't need an audience to process emotion. Sometimes, it just needs space. And often, the still moments of your day, when your hands are busy but your thoughts are free, become the stage where these inner dialogues unfold. You might replay the moment where someone raised their voice, even if it wasn't at you. Or imagine what you'd say if your boss criticized you tomorrow. Or craft the lines you'd speak if an ex reached out again. There's no limit to what the mind can stage. And each imagined fight tells a story, not just about fear, but about care. Because we don't argue in our minds with people we don't care about. Not really. Even the people who frustrate us, who intimidate us, who exhaust us. If we're rehearsing dialogue with them, there's something in us that still hopes to be heard, still longs for clarity, or peace, or dignity. I once spent an entire week preparing for a conversation that never happened. I thought I'd run into someone from my past, someone I had so much to say to, and every night I practiced the dialogue like I was preparing for a play. It never came, but it wasn't wasted. because I realized I was speaking to myself, really, giving voice to parts of me I'd kept quiet. That's what these rehearsals often are. You think you're preparing for them, but sometimes you're finally listening to you, to the part of you that never got to speak up, to the part that's still carrying a memory it didn't know how to process at the time. That's why these fights feel real, because they hold real emotions, even if the context is imagined. Even if the words never leave your mouth, the emotional signature is the same. Your brain floods with the same chemicals, your heart responds, your body believes. And in that moment, you're not pretending, you're processing. It can help to notice when these rehearsals start. Not to stop them, but to gently track them. What are you trying to protect? Who are you trying to reach? What truth is struggling to be heard? If you listen softly, without judgment, you might find that behind the imagined conflict is a very real need. To feel safe, to feel respected, to feel prepared, to not be blindsided by emotion. That's not neurotic, that's ancient. And sometimes, just acknowledging it can shift the experience. You don't need to silence the rehearsal. You can just let it run its course, like a wave in your emotional weather. Let it crest, let it fall, let it go, or not. Either way, you're not broken for having these arguments in your head. You're trying, in the quiet corners of your mind, to give yourself a voice. And that, in itself, is a kind of care, a kind of courage. There's a certain moment in these mental arguments that feels oddly triumphant. You've probably felt it. The sudden clarity, the perfect phrasing, the satisfying delivery of exactly what you wish you'd said. It lands with the elegance of a movie script, full of wit, insight, maybe even grace. And in your mind, the room goes quiet. They understand. You win. It's not about humiliation or cruelty. It's about finally being heard, being clear, being seen in the way you wish you'd been. There's a pleasure in it, a kind of quiet justice, even if it only happens in your head. This fantasy of winning the argument, of finding the words, speaks to something deeper than ego. It touches on your desire for resolution, for self-expression without fear, for the impossible wish that emotional messes could be cleaned up with a few perfect lines. In that imagined version, you aren't flustered, you don't freeze, you don't cry too early or laugh too late. You say exactly what needs to be said, with perfect timing. The scene ends differently. You're not left pacing or replaying or regretting, just a soft internal click, like a puzzle piece finally finding its place. And sometimes this fantasy doesn't even come from conflict. Sometimes it comes from silence, the conversation that never happened, the moment you wish you had spoken up, asked a question, drawn a boundary, told the truth. These unsaid things hang in the air long after the moment passes. And your mind, ever creative, ever unfinished, writes the version where you were ready, where you didn't hesitate, where you didn't let fear make the choice. It can feel like closure, even if it's imaginary, because in the imagined version, you finally arrive, fully present, fully equipped. You bring the entire weight of your awareness into that one sentence. The fantasy is not about dominance. It's about restoration, about restoring the version of you that you needed in that moment, a version that didn't shrink, that didn't apologize for taking up space, that didn't choose silence because it felt safer than the unknown. And yes, it can feel indulgent, maybe even ridiculous at times. Play acting conversations alone in the car or in the shower, or walking down the frozen food aisle. But the impulse isn't silly. It's psychological repair work, gently done by the subconscious. Because when we imagine saying the perfect thing, we're not just trying to fix the moment. We're trying to fix how it made us feel. I've had entire commutes where I played that fantasy in my head like a playlist. Different versions, different endings, same craving. I wasn't even angry most of the time. I just wanted a do-over. A second chance to bring the best version of myself into a moment I left feeling off kilter. And it's strange. Sometimes just imagining that version can shift something. It doesn't change the past, no, but it changes the emotional weight of the memory. The tension softens, the regret quiets. It's like your mind is giving itself the permission to be whole in hindsight, to be articulate, confident, brave. Maybe it never happened that way, but imagining it lets you grieve what didn't happen without punishing yourself for it. These moments of imagined victory, these mental mic drops, serve a kind of emotional bookkeeping. They close the tab your brain left open. They resolve the scene your heart didn't get to finish. And they do it in the language of performance, of poetry, of perfectly timed silence and precision. There's a reason we crave it. Words are our tools for meaning. And when the words failed us in the moment, when we stuttered, or softened, or silenced ourselves, it can feel like a kind of betrayal. Not by others, but by our own voice. So when we imagine winning the argument, we're trying to reclaim something. Not power over the other person, but power over our own sense of coherence. We want to feel whole, to look back and say, that was me, fully me. Not the me who froze or backed down or avoided eye contact. The fantasy helps us find that version again. And sometimes, even imagining it reminds us that we're still capable of showing up that way. That version isn't gone, just quiet, waiting. You might find this fantasy sneaking in during the oddest moments. Half asleep, tired after a long day, walking a familiar loop around your neighborhood. A memory surfaces, not painfully, but persistently. You see the scene, the expression on their face, the way your hands fidgeted, and then your mind rewrites it, mid-stride. You hold your ground. You speak without flinching. They listen. They pause. And maybe, just maybe, they understand you. There's something healing in that image, even if they never will, even if the real person would never have reacted that way, because it's not really about them anymore. It's about you, about the version of you who needed to feel seen and safe and strong. And sometimes the fantasy goes further. You imagine not just what you'd say, but how it would feel. The release in your chest, the steadiness in your breathing, the clarity in your tone. Maybe you'd cry a little, or smile, finally. And they'd respond with grace, or silence, or apology, or maybe nothing at all. But it wouldn't matter, because in this version, you're no longer invisible in your own story. You're not the background character to someone else's moment. You are central, whole. And that can feel surprisingly real, even in imagination. Your nervous system doesn't need external confirmation to feel soothed. Sometimes, the imagined clarity is enough to calm the actual storm. Not always, but enough, sometimes. What's curious is how rehearsed these scenes can become. You revisit the same lines, the same gestures. You craft the dialogue with such care you'd think you were directing a film. But it's not vanity. It's longing. Longing for a moment that was tidy, true, undeniable. And because real life is rarely that elegant, the mind makes its own poetry, its own structure. And in doing so, gives you back a little dignity. The fantasy of winning the argument may not solve anything in the outside world, but it soothes the inside world. The part of you that needed to know you could hold your own, that your voice, though silenced once, could still rise again. Let it. Let yourself imagine the scene. Not to live in it, but to loosen what it's been holding, to recognize what your mind is trying to do. You're not crazy, you're not bitter, you're processing, you're healing, you're giving shape to something that never got closure. And while imagination can't rewrite history, it can give your heart something to hold. A picture of what self-respect might have looked like in the moment, even if it arrived late. I remember once, before a big presentation at work, I spent hours, not on the slides, but on mentally preparing for every possible question. What if they challenged me? What if I forgot something? I rehearsed each answer in my head like a script, and for a moment, it made me feel safe. But the strange thing is, the more I rehearsed, the more tense I became. It didn't feel like confidence. It felt like bracing. Control is a comforting illusion, especially when it comes to emotions. Maybe you felt this too. That small sense of reassurance when you mentally prepare a conversation before it happens. When you write a whole script in your head for how you'll react, how they'll respond, and how it might unfold. It gives you a sense of readiness, doesn't it? As if by rehearsing enough, you'll be able to prevent yourself from being caught off guard. Like you can soften the emotional impact by planning for it in advance. The mind tries to simulate reality in a way that feels safe. It's like packing an emotional umbrella for every kind of weather, just in case. But the truth is, what you're often protecting yourself from isn't a particular person or event. It's vulnerability itself. That exposed feeling that comes when someone misreads you, surprises you, challenges you, hurts you. And because vulnerability is unpredictable, the mind does what it knows best. It prepares. It imagines. It rehearses every version of what might happen, as if emotional preparedness could somehow equal emotional immunity. But it can't. That doesn't stop us from trying. The imagined rehearsals, the looping what-ifs, the drafted text messages never sent, they're all symptoms of the same deeper desire, to stay in control of what might emotionally destabilize us. Because real conversations are messy. People interrupt. Emotions rise unexpectedly. Your voice can shake. And if you've ever walked away from a moment like that feeling regretful, misunderstood, or exposed, then of course your mind wants to avoid repeating it. Of course it builds a fortress of imagined responses. A script, a shield, a performance. Even if the curtain never rises, even if the moment never comes, it's the practice that feels like protection. And yet, ironically, this control doesn't always create peace. It can trap you. The more you rehearse, the more pressure you may feel to execute it perfectly. You end up performing for a stage that doesn't exist. You attach to the fantasy version of the moment, and real life, unpredictable, unscripted, starts to feel threatening. You may even avoid certain conversations altogether because you haven't finished preparing the script in your mind. It's like an actor refusing to go on stage because the lighting hasn't been adjusted just right. But life isn't a set. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. And that's what makes emotional vulnerability so hard. You have to step into moments without knowing the outcome, without being able to perfectly plan your reactions, without knowing how you'll feel. And for many of us, especially those who've had experiences where emotions felt unsafe or out of control, that's terrifying. So instead, the mind keeps rehearsing, not because it enjoys the loop, but because it's trying to build a bridge, from fear to safety. The bridge might be imaginary, but the need behind it is very real. I've done this more times than I can count. Gone over a conversation in my head for days, believing that if I just said it right, I could control how they felt, how they reacted, how I would feel walking away. It rarely works like that. But in the moment, it felt like the only way to protect myself. And maybe that's what it always is. Self-protection disguised as planning. We don't rehearse because we want control over others. We rehearse because we don't want to be blindsided by our own emotion. We don't want to freeze or fall apart or be misunderstood. And so we over-prepare. We imagine scenarios from every angle. We assign lines to people who haven't even spoken yet. We set the emotional temperature of the room before we've even stepped into it. And we do it because uncertainty feels dangerous, especially emotional uncertainty. Because if you've ever been surprised by hurt before, if you've ever felt exposed, dismissed, or shamed in real time, then you know how deeply the body remembers that. So the mind starts filling in blanks before they appear. It doesn't trust the moment to unfold naturally. It wants a map, a plan, a lifeline. And what's strange is that these mental rehearsals often have very little to do with what's actually going to happen. The conversation you've prepared for might never occur. The person you've scripted a monologue for might never ask the question you're bracing for. But that doesn't mean your brain sees it as wasted effort. It sees it as survival. It doesn't need the moment to be real. It just needs to believe it's prepared. And sometimes that belief is enough to soothe the edge. But other times, it just deepens the loop. You find yourself editing the same mental paragraph for the 5th time. You rewrite the tone of voice you'll use. You shift the posture. You add a pause for emphasis. You remove the part that felt too vulnerable. And now you're not just avoiding the unknown, you're micromanaging your emotional exposure. The thing is, vulnerability isn't something you can rehearse into perfection. It's a risk, a necessary one. And the more you try to polish it, the more you risk making your interactions feel distant, disconnected, or overly controlled. Sometimes the most human moments are the messiest ones. When you stumble over your words, when your voice breaks, when you say something imperfect but real. Those moments are where connection actually lives, not in the polished performance, but in the courage to show up unrehearsed. This part can be hard to hear, especially if you're someone who feels safe in preparation. There's nothing wrong with that. Planning is a form of care. But when it becomes the only way we engage with others, when we believe we can't be okay unless we've rehearsed every possible response, then we're no longer preparing. We're bracing. And there's a difference. Preparation is empowering. Bracing is constricting. One opens you to the moment. The other holds you hostage to it. And the truth is, no amount of rehearsal can ever fully control how you'll feel. Emotions arrive on their own terms. They don't ask for permission. And sometimes, letting go of control is the very thing that allows them to move through you gently, instead of building up like pressure behind a dam. Because when you stop rehearsing every word, you make space for presence, for listening, for actual connection, not just mental projection. You stop trying to predict every line, and instead, you learn to trust yourself to respond in real time. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. Emotional wisdom. The kind that grows slowly, after many moments of realizing that no amount of control can protect you from being human. Maybe the most radical thing isn't being prepared. It's being willing to be unprepared. To step into a moment with open hands instead of a closed script. To risk being seen without your armor of clever words and calm tone and careful delivery. Because the truth is, the people who matter, the ones who really see you, don't need you to be rehearsed. They need you to be real. And sometimes, that means letting go of the fantasy that you can control how you'll feel, how they'll respond, or how the conversation will end. Sometimes, it means sitting in the discomfort of not knowing, of saying, "I'm not sure," or "this is hard for me to talk about," or even just letting silence stretch between you without trying to fill it. That kind of presence is powerful. And the more you practice it, the more you realize that vulnerability isn't something to be avoided. It's something to be navigated. Gently, patiently, imperfectly. You don't need to be perfectly composed to be safe. You don't need to rehearse every conversation to be understood. You just need to show up, again and again, as the version of yourself who is willing to risk being known. I once sent a message to someone I cared about, just a simple check-in, but their reply felt distant, cold. And even though I knew logically it might have just been timing, I spent the entire evening rewriting my original text in my head. Softer tone, clearer wording. I kept wondering what version of me they might have responded to differently. That night wasn't about fixing a message. It was about fixing the feeling that I'd messed something up. Regret is one of the heaviest emotions the mind carries, not because it screams the loudest, but because it lingers the longest, floating just beneath the surface of everyday thoughts, waiting for the quiet moments to return. You might be folding clothes, looking out a window, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and suddenly there it is again. That moment, that choice, that sentence you wish you hadn't said, or the silence you wish you had filled. And your mind, ever loyal in its mission to protect you, doesn't just let the moment pass. It loops it, edits it, replays it with better timing, softer delivery, more courage, less fear. It's not because you want to dwell. It's because something about the moment still feels open, like a door you forgot to close. That's what regret does. It turns the past into an unfinished space, and the mind, uncomfortable with ambiguity, tries to tidy it up. Even when there's no way back. Even when the person is long gone, the situation has passed, the words can't be unsaid. Your brain doesn't necessarily believe it can change history, but it does believe it can change how you carry it. So it rewrites, not as denial, but as comfort. A psychological balm over an emotional bruise. You replay what you could have done. You rewrite what you could have said. And even though you know, logically, that it's over, it still feels like something is unresolved. Like a part of you is frozen inside that scene, waiting for a better ending. Sometimes the regret is sharp, born from a clear mistake. Other times it's vague, more of a feeling than a fact. A sense that you missed something, that you could have shown up differently, that you weren't quite yourself. And that's the hardest part. The dissonance between who you are now and who you were then. It's painful to feel like you let yourself down, that you abandoned your values, or your voice, or your vulnerability in a moment that mattered. So your mind goes back, not to shame you, but to try to understand. to try to recover some sense of integrity. It says, if I can just figure out where I went wrong, I can make sure it never happens again. And that's the secret behind all those imaginary do-overs. They're not indulgent. They're protective. Your brain is scanning the past to prevent future pain, trying to preempt regret before it happens again. So it replays the last version, searching for clues. Where did the discomfort begin? What could have changed the course? What needs to be different next time? And suddenly, without meaning to, you're not just replaying, you're rehearsing again. This time, not for performance, but for prevention. I've spent entire nights stuck in that loop, not angry, not anxious, just haunted by a moment that didn't feel finished. A goodbye I rushed, a boundary I didn't hold, a feeling I swallowed, and even though I knew I couldn't go back, my mind kept offering me new versions of the scene, like it was trying to soothe me with better endings. I didn't want to forget the moment. I just didn't want to hurt every time I remembered it. That's what regret often is. Not a desire to erase the past, but a wish to remember it without flinching. A hope that maybe, with enough mental revisions, the story can feel more bearable. There's a tenderness in that, even if it's exhausting. Because behind every rehearsal, every mental edit, every internal monologue, there's a part of you that's trying to be accountable, trying to grow, trying to hold yourself to a standard you now understand better. That's not weakness, that's maturity. It means you're not numb, it means you care. The only danger is when that caring turns cruel, when self-reflection becomes self-punishment, when your inner critic takes over the rehearsal room and turns every mistake into a moral failure. That's when the loop becomes damaging, when it stops being protective and starts being punitive. But it doesn't have to go that way. You can still reflect without ruminating. You can acknowledge regret without being swallowed by it. It begins by noticing the impulse to rewrite and asking yourself gently, what am I trying to fix here? What part of me is still hurting? Because regret isn't just about the facts of what happened, it's about the emotions we attach to those facts, the shame, the sadness, the helplessness, and those emotions need acknowledgement more than they need solutions. They don't want you to fix the past. They want you to feel it, grieve it, and then, eventually, to forgive it.
That's not easy, especially if you're someone who holds yourself to high standards. If you pride yourself on thoughtfulness, on emotional awareness, on integrity, then the moments when you didn't live up to those ideals can cut especially deep. But part of being human and growing is recognizing that you can't be perfect in real time. Sometimes your understanding lags behind the moment. Sometimes clarity comes late. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you're evolving. And the fact that your mind is revisiting the scene now, that you're seeing it with new eyes, is proof that you've changed, that you've grown into someone who can see the past with more nuance. That's a quiet kind of progress, invisible, maybe, but real. And the beauty of this kind of growth is that it softens future moments. You don't need to be haunted by the past to honor it. You can let it teach you without letting it define you. Let's take a breath together. This is tender work. And maybe part of you is still holding a moment like this, a regret that doesn't quite fade, no matter how much time passes. It's okay. You're not alone in that. We all have moments we wish we could redo, conversations we wish we could rewind. But sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is let that scene remain unfinished. Not because it doesn't matter, but because your healing matters more. Let the past version of you be a snapshot, not a sentence, a moment, not a measure of your worth. And if you feel yourself trying to preempt the next regret by overthinking, over-preparing, over-rehearsing, pause. Ask yourself if what you're really trying to do is protect your heart. If so, that's okay. That's human. But hearts aren't meant to be bubble-wrapped. They're meant to be lived in, messy, brave, open. And if you misstep again, and you will, you'll know how to come back to yourself with more kindness. Because regret doesn't have to close you down. It can also open you up. to reflection, to empathy, to softness. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of peace. Before job interviews, I used to simulate every possible outcome. Not just the normal questions. I'd rehearse how I'd respond if someone challenged my experience, misheard my answer, even if my camera froze mid-sentence. I thought I was calming myself, but sometimes I'd be so drained by the time the real thing started, I barely felt present for it. It wasn't just preparation, it was self-protection. Anxiety often doesn't announce itself with panic or urgency. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised as planning, as preparation, as imagining every possible version of a moment that hasn't happened yet. You catch yourself mid-thought, creating entire conversations in your head, preloading your responses, adjusting your tone. You go over what you'll say if they say this, what you'll do if they react like that. You simulate different timelines, mapping out cause and effect like a strategist preparing for an emotional chess match. It's not that you're trying to obsess, it's that you're trying to feel safer. And somewhere deep in your nervous system, this process of mental rehearsal offers a strange, temporary comfort. It gives you a sense that by imagining it enough, you'll be able to manage it better when or if it happens. And that's the thing. Anxiety isn't always about what's happening. It's about what could happen, what might happen, what might go wrong. And the brain, trying to protect you, begins to rehearse scenarios as a form of emotional regulation. It's like running emergency drills in your head, practicing not because disaster is guaranteed, but because the idea of not being prepared feels worse than the idea of the disaster itself. And so you simulate, over and over, until sometimes you can't tell the difference between what you've imagined and what's real. Because your body reacts anyway. Your heart speeds up, your muscles tighten, your breathing shallows, even though nothing has actually happened. This is the strange power of mental rehearsal. The brain doesn't need the real thing to produce a real emotional response. It only needs the suggestion. A single thought can be enough to light up the entire alarm system. But what makes these simulations feel so necessary is the illusion of control they provide. If I practice the words enough, maybe I won't freeze. If I imagine every possible version, maybe I won't be surprised. If I mentally prepare for the worst, maybe it won't hurt as much. These are the whispered beliefs beneath our anxiety rehearsals, gentle, desperate promises to ourselves that we won't be as vulnerable next time. And sometimes, to be fair, it works. Sometimes the rehearsal gives us language we didn't have before, a sense of clarity, a feeling of, I know what I want to say. That kind of preparation can be grounding, but it's a fine line, because the rehearsal can also become a trap. You run the same scenario over and over, looking for the perfect response, the safest outcome, the least risky route, and you never find it. Because emotional life isn't predictable. People are unpredictable, and no amount of simulation can protect you from the fact that being alive, being open, being human, is inherently uncertain. I used to think if I could just simulate enough conversations in my head, I'd finally stop feeling anxious, that I could outthink the discomfort. But more often than not, the rehearsal became the source of the stress, not the solution. I'd lose hours playing out what someone might say and what I'd say back, only to walk into the real conversation and have it go completely differently, or not happen at all. And that's when I started to notice. I wasn't rehearsing to prepare, I was rehearsing to avoid the feeling of being unprepared. There's a difference. One empowers, the other exhausts. Still, the need behind it is tender. When you feel anxious, your mind looks for patterns, for narratives, for a way to stay one step ahead of anything that might hurt. And rehearsal becomes the mind's way of saying, I don't want to be blindsided. The simulation itself feels like a soft shield, not because it's impenetrable, but because it's familiar. When you're inside the imagined version, you have control. You can pause the scene. You can edit the dialogue.
You can choose your facial expression. That sense of authorship, of being the one in charge, offers a break from the chaos of real life. And for someone who feels overwhelmed by social interaction or by emotional unpredictability, that break can feel vital. It's not that you're trying to overthink. It's that your body needs somewhere safe to land, so your mind builds a landscape of imagined safety, a world where you can rehearse outcomes until they stop feeling dangerous, even if they never felt dangerous to anyone else, even if the threat is only in your nervous system, not in the external world.
Take a moment to soften. This isn't about pathologizing your imagination. It's about understanding why your brain reaches for rehearsal in the first place. Because if you've ever lived with chronic stress or grown up in an unpredictable environment, your nervous system may have learned that surprise equals danger, that the unknown is unsafe. So now, even as an adult, even in everyday conversations, your mind tries to eliminate uncertainty by predicting it away. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means your mind adapted. It means your inner world got smart at simulating life so you wouldn't feel so startled by it. That's a kind of intelligence, but it's also exhausting to live in a constant simulation, because the more you rehearse, the more your body believes it's happening. You rehearse the breakup, the job interview, the apology, the confrontation. And each time, your body goes through it too. You may not notice it, but your muscles are practicing tension. Your breath is practicing restriction. And that can wear you down. Simulation becomes its own stressor, one that doesn't get resolved because it was never real to begin with. So what do we do with this? How do we honor the safety simulation brings without becoming imprisoned by it? Maybe it starts with noticing when the rehearsal begins and pausing to ask, is this helping me feel prepared, or is this helping me feel in control? Because those are different goals. Preparedness is flexible. It allows for change. It knows the moment will evolve and trusts you to evolve with it. Control is rigid. It needs every word planned. It fears improvisation. It says, if it doesn't go like this, I won't know what to do. And the truth is, you will. You've done it before. You've handled awkward conversations. You've survived discomfort. You've found words even when your script disappeared. The simulation isn't wrong. It's just limited. It can't predict the nuances of timing, or the warmth of someone's eyes, or the unexpected grace that appears in real human connection. It can't predict your own strength in the moment. And sometimes, your strength only reveals itself when the rehearsal ends, when you let go of the imagined version and step into the real one, flawed, unscripted, alive. That doesn't mean you need to stop rehearsing completely. It just means you get to hold the rehearsal with a lighter touch. You get to say, I'm imagining this to soothe my nervous system, but I know the real thing will be different, and I trust myself to meet it when it comes. That kind of self-trust is what loosens the grip of anxiety. Not certainty, not control, but the quiet belief that even if the moment surprises you, you'll still be okay. That you don't need to simulate every outcome to survive it. That you can show up as you are, unrehearsed, a little nervous, a little human, and still find connection, still speak, still be heard, and maybe even feel safe. The mind's habit of rehearsing conversations, especially difficult ones, doesn't begin with modern anxiety or overthinking. It begins deep in our evolutionary wiring, in the part of us that still believes every social interaction could be a matter of survival. You may not feel that consciously, but your body does. And it's not irrational. For most of human history, we've survived not as lone individuals, but as part of tightly knit social groups. Our ancestors didn't just depend on food and shelter. They depended on belonging, to the tribe, to the village, to the social fabric that held their place in the world. Rejection wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. To be excluded was to be left without protection.
And so the brain evolved mechanisms to detect social threat just as urgently as physical threat. A glare, a cold tone, a prolonged silence, a subtle shift in someone's facial expression. These weren't just interpersonal cues. They were potential warnings. Is this safe? Am I accepted? Am I at risk of losing my place here? Those questions didn't just live in abstract thought. They lived in the body, in the tightening of the chest, in the elevated heart rate, in the watchfulness of your gaze. And while today's world is very different, you won't be left to freeze in the woods because a coworker rolled their eyes. The wiring remains. The emotional alarm system is still sensitive, still quick to fire, still scanning for signs of exclusion or judgment. And that's part of why rehearsing confrontation feels so automatic. Your brain is responding to what it perceives as a possible rupture in your social safety net. It wants you to be prepared. Not because you're dramatic, but because it remembers a time, not personally but ancestrally, when being unprepared could mean exile. This is why a simple conversation with a boss, a partner, a parent, or a friend can feel disproportionately intense. It's not just the content, it's the perceived stakes. Your brain doesn't separate, "they might misunderstand me," from "they might cast me out." It doesn't differentiate "I made a mistake" from "I'm no longer safe here." So you rehearse. Your mind builds the scene, assigns lines, imagines outcomes. It wants you to stay connected. Or, if connection isn't possible, it wants you to preserve dignity, to maintain some kind of emotional shelter. And in doing so, it activates parts of your nervous system that don't distinguish between metaphorical and actual threat. You feel it in your shoulders, in your stomach, in your throat. You feel it when your voice gets small, or when it gets too loud, when your face flushes or your hands shake. These are social survival signals, echoes of a brain that evolved to read the room not for comfort, but for safety. And once you start to notice that, something shifts. You realize the mental rehearsal isn't just about the words. It's about protecting your place in the world. I remember once having to confront someone I loved about something small. Logically, it wasn't a big deal, but I found myself rehearsing the conversation again and again for days. Not because I feared conflict, but because I feared disconnection. I wasn't trying to win the argument. I was trying to protect the bond, to keep the thread between us intact. And I think that's what these mental arguments are often about. We're not afraid of the moment itself. We're afraid of what the moment might break. Your brain, ever vigilant, sees conflict as a possible fracture, a rupture in the social fabric that keeps you emotionally tethered. And because it can't control the other person, their response, their tone, their openness, it turns inward. It fine-tunes your words, your posture, your strategy. It makes you the variable you can control. And that's not weakness, that's adaptation. Your social cognition, the part of your brain that helps you read others, is designed to be predictive. It wants to know what's coming. It wants to guess their reaction. It wants to build a model so it can prepare you emotionally. And sometimes, that works. The preparation pays off. You go into the conversation steadier, more clear, less reactive. But other times, the model is wrong. The prediction falls apart. They say something you didn't expect, or they say nothing at all. And suddenly you're reminded that human interaction isn't math. It's music. Unpredictable, improvisational, messy. Still, the urge to simulate remains. Because the cost of being emotionally unprepared, of being surprised by hurt or rejection, is so high. Especially if, somewhere in your life, you've experienced moments of sudden emotional rupture. A betrayal, a dismissal, a silence that said more than words ever could. Those moments teach the brain to be vigilant, to stay ahead of the next potential wound. And so the social threat detector stays on, even when you wish it wouldn't, even when it keeps you awake at night, practicing a conversation that may never happen. You're not doing it because you enjoy it. You're doing it because your brain believes it's necessary. That simulation equals safety. That if you prepare enough, it won't hurt as much. But here's the quiet truth. It still might. no matter how many times you practice, no matter how thoughtful or careful or articulate you are, because people are unpredictable. And sometimes that unpredictability stings. But you're not powerless, because even if you can't control their reaction, you can understand your own. You can witness the rehearsal and ask, what am I protecting right now? What wound am I trying to avoid reopening? What outcome am I afraid would threaten my sense of belonging? This part runs deep, because it's not just about overthinking. It's about the ancient emotional machinery beneath it. The part of you that's scanning for signs of rejection like it's a matter of survival. And in a way, it is. Emotional safety is a real need. We're wired to seek it, crave it, cling to it. And when it's at risk, even slightly, the rehearsal begins. Not to dramatize, but to defend. And maybe that awareness alone softens something. Maybe the next time you catch yourself preparing a conversation in your head, you'll pause and ask, is this about the words, or is this about the safety I hope they'll bring? Because often, it's not what we want to say that matters most. It's what we want to feel. Heard, seen, understood, accepted. Those are primal needs, not personality quirks. They live in your nervous system, and they influence every conversation, every silence, every mental script. And maybe, with that knowledge, you can let go of the rehearsal a little sooner. Not entirely, but gently. You can say to yourself, I'm preparing because I care, because I want to stay connected, because I want this to go well. And that kind of preparation, when rooted in self-compassion, can be grounding. Not an attempt to avoid vulnerability, but a way to walk into it with softness. You don't have to get the words perfect to be safe. You don't have to predict every outcome to be okay. You just have to stay connected to the part of you that's doing the rehearsing. Because she's not trying to perform, she's trying to protect you. And maybe, just maybe, she doesn't need to work so hard when you remind her that you are already safe. I had a friend in college who used to go quiet during conflict. No anger, just silence. And every time it happened, I'd spiral, preparing texts I never sent, rewriting things I'd said, trying to guess what I'd done wrong. Later, I realized that reaction had nothing to do with her. It was a leftover reflex from childhood, when silence meant danger. My mind wasn't just rehearsing, it was reliving. Sometimes the mind doesn't just rehearse, it braces. And it does so not because you're fragile or overly sensitive, but because somewhere in your past, something taught you that danger can come quietly, suddenly, and often without warning. So you stay alert. Not visibly, maybe. On the outside, you might seem calm. But inside, there's a watchtower, always scanning, always listening, always preparing. This is hypervigilance, not as a conscious choice, but as a conditioned response, a nervous system on high alert, primed to detect any possible sign of emotional threat. It happens when your system, once overwhelmed by real or perceived danger, decides it can't afford to be surprised again. And so it keeps the engine running, always on standby, ready to jump in and protect you from a moment that might feel like something you've lived through before. Maybe it was a moment when someone raised their voice and it wasn't safe, or when silence meant punishment, or when love came with conditions. Maybe you were dismissed for sharing how you felt, or made to feel small for having needs. Maybe you learned early that peace is something you earn by anticipating someone else's mood, by staying one step ahead of conflict. Whatever the source, your body remembers, even if your conscious mind doesn't. And that memory isn't stored in words. It's stored in reactions, in the way your shoulders tense before you even know why, in the way your thoughts speed up when a conversation starts to feel off, in the way you mentally script dialogues that haven't happened yet, all in the name of being ready. Not because you're dramatic, but because your body believes that safety depends on it. Hypervigilance is a survival mechanism, and for many, it was necessary. It helped you move through environments where emotional terrain was uneven, where sudden shifts could mean pain or shame or abandonment. It taught you to read between the lines, to detect subtle shifts in tone, posture, mood, anything that might signal risk. And while that sensitivity may have kept you safe back then, it can become exhausting now, because your brain doesn't always know how to turn the volume down. It doesn't always recognize when it's safe to rest. So it keeps running simulations, rehearsing arguments, anticipating reactions, imagining every way a conversation could go wrong, not to control others, but to reduce the element of surprise, to minimize the emotional shock your body still fears. And even though you know, intellectually, that not every interaction is dangerous, the fear isn't happening in your thoughts. It's happening in your wiring. The nervous system doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in sensation, in muscle memory, in visceral reactions that don't always make sense, but always make themselves known. I remember realizing this when I over-prepared for a conversation that ended up being completely benign. I had practiced my words, rehearsed their potential comebacks, prepared emotionally for rejection or defensiveness, and instead, they listened calmly, kindly. And I felt confused. Not relieved at first, confused, because my body had been ready for battle, and now it didn't know what to do with all that leftover adrenaline. That's when I understood that sometimes the rehearsal isn't about the person in front of you. It's about the person who's still behind you. The version of you who needed protection back then, and never quite felt like they got it. This is why hypervigilance feels so irrational yet so real. It's not just anxiety about the future. It's a memory of the past disguised as preparation, a trauma echo, a nervous system still responding to an emotional event that no longer exists, except in how it shaped your reflexes. So when your mind starts rehearsing a conversation or preparing for confrontation, it's not always about the current situation. It's about an old wound that got poked, a familiar pattern, an old emotional threat wearing a new face. And the rehearsal begins not to manage the moment, but to manage the fear. Fear of not being believed, fear of being dismissed, fear of being too much, fear of being too quiet, fear of being hurt, again, in the same way. The fear is often subtle. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, just loud enough for your nervous system to notice, just enough to keep you up at night crafting responses for situations that haven't even unfolded yet. But the fear is felt in the body, so the mind responds with thought, with logic, with language. It rehearses because it can't stand the chaos of not knowing what will happen. This is one of the harder truths, because it asks us to notice the places where we're still living through moments that have technically passed, where we're still rehearsing for people who are no longer in the room, or for dynamics that aren't present anymore, but whose imprint lives on in our biology. And it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you adapted. It means you got through something by learning to stay ahead of it. And that instinct to mentally pre-live future pain in order to feel prepared is rooted in your intelligence, your sensitivity, your resilience. But the body doesn't always update its assumptions as fast as your mind does. You might now have boundaries, clarity, voice, but your nervous system may still be operating like it's 10 steps behind, waiting for the world to shift again. So you rehearse, you anticipate, you check and double-check the emotional map before you take a single step. Because a part of you still doesn't trust that the ground is solid, that this moment might be different.
And maybe, over time, that can start to shift. Not by forcing the rehearsal to stop, but by gently asking the deeper question, what am I still trying to protect? What part of me still doesn't feel safe? What version of me am I defending with all this overthinking? Often, that part of you is very young, very quiet, and very tired. Tired of rehearsing every possible outcome. Tired of having to be 10 steps ahead. Tired of carrying the weight of the past into every future interaction. And what it really needs isn't more rehearsal, it's reassurance. Reassurance that you're safe now, that the moment is new, that you have more tools than you used to, that not every conversation is a minefield, that not every disagreement is danger, that not every silence means abandonment. These aren't truths your nervous system accepts overnight, but they're truths you can gently return to again and again each time the rehearsal begins. You can say, I know why I'm doing this, I know where this comes from, and I know I'm safe now. That kind of self-talk isn't cheesy, it's neurological care. It tells the body what it forgot to believe. And slowly, the rehearsals lose their urgency. They may not disappear, but they soften, and you begin to live more in the present than in the echo of the past. At the heart of many imagined arguments, beneath the logic, the anger, the counterpoints and closing lines, is something far softer. A longing. Not necessarily to be right, but to be understood, to be seen clearly, to have your experience validated not because you won an argument, but because someone finally paused, listened, and said, I get it. I see why that mattered to you. This need, the desire for recognition, emotional acknowledgement, even approval, is one of the most quietly powerful forces shaping our inner rehearsals. It's what turns a disagreement into a loop, what turns a passing comment into an echo chamber of imagined rebuttals and clarifications. It's not always about pride or control. More often, it's about connection and the fear that it's slipping away. Maybe you've noticed this in your own mind, that when you mentally replay or rewrite an argument, the part you obsess over isn't the facts, it's the moment where you felt invisible, misread, unfairly judged, or worse, emotionally erased. The moment when your tone was misunderstood or your silence was misinterpreted. And suddenly, your whole being is trying to say, that's not what I meant. Not because you want to argue, but because you want to be known. That's what attachment does. It links your sense of security not just to being accepted, but to being accurately perceived. And when that thread frays, when someone important to you misunderstands your intention, your heart, your truth, it doesn't just feel like a social mishap. It feels like emotional displacement, like being evicted from a space you thought was safe. We all carry inner maps of how we expect people to respond to us. And those maps are drawn, often unconsciously, from the attachment patterns we formed early in life. If connection felt conditional, based on performance, compliance, emotional tone, then conflict might feel like threat. Not because disagreement is inherently dangerous, but because it carries the risk of losing approval. And for many, that approval was once a lifeline. So even now, as adults, we try to preserve it. We rehearse conversations with people we care about, hoping to find the right phrasing, the perfect pacing, the gentle boundary that won't trigger distance. The mind, loyal and creative, becomes a diplomat, negotiating between truth and belonging. How can I say what I need to say without pushing them away? How can I be honest without being abandoned? These are not conscious questions most of the time, but they're deeply embedded in our mental rehearsals. They drive the fantasy of resolution, of being understood completely, maybe even praised for our clarity. And if we don't get that externally, we simulate it internally.
We imagine their response. The moment they finally say, "I didn't know you felt that way. Thank you for telling me." It sounds simple, but the impact is profound, because that moment, even imagined, offers the illusion of repair, of mutual recognition, of restored attachment. I've definitely done this with people I care about most: family, friends, partners. It's not the conflict itself that stings. It's the gap, that feeling of emotional distance where once there was warmth. And in that space, my mind starts filling in the blanks, rehearsing ways to close it, wishing for a sentence that will unlock something, that will make them say, "You make sense to me." Because honestly, that's what I'm craving more than anything. This craving, to be understood, is often mislabeled as overthinking or sensitivity. But it's neither. It's attachment in motion. And it makes sense. Human beings are wired to bond, to co-regulate, to feel safe in the presence of others. And when that safety feels interrupted, especially by emotional misattunement, our minds go to work, not to win the fight, but to win back the connection, even if the only arena available is imagination. So we simulate, we edit our responses, we refine our tone, we imagine being softer, or stronger, or clearer, and sometimes we even imagine their transformation, the version of them who finally understands us, who mirrors back empathy, who validates what was once dismissed. This isn't delusion, it's emotional rehearsal, and it's deeply human, because for many of us, rupture in connection feels intolerable, not because we're weak, but because we've been wired to associate understanding with safety. Gently notice how this lands. These patterns don't mean you're needy or codependent or too much. They mean you care deeply about emotional congruence, that the harmony between your inner experience and how you're perceived matters to you. That misalignment isn't just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. And that's okay. It makes sense that you'd want to fix it, to make it make sense, to clarify, even if only in your head. The rehearsal becomes a form of self-regulation, a way to soothe the anxiety that comes with relational ambiguity. Because uncertainty in connection, especially with people we're attached to, triggers a kind of emotional vertigo. And in that spinning, the mind reaches for grounding. What would I say if I could say it perfectly? How could I explain what I meant, how I felt, in a way that makes them understand me truly? These are not vain questions. They're the echo of early emotional blueprints. And often, the adult mind is trying to meet needs that the younger self didn't know how to name. So maybe the next time you find yourself mentally revisiting a conversation, you could pause and ask, what is it I want them to understand? Not what you want them to admit, not what you want them to change, but what truth in you is still waiting for acknowledgement. That kind of clarity can shift everything, because then the rehearsal isn't about winning, it's about witnessing. Witnessing your own emotional landscape, your own longing, your own vulnerability, and giving it the empathy you wish someone else would. This doesn't mean the rehearsal will stop. It may still come, especially when attachment feels shaky, but you can greet it differently. Not as a performance to perfect, but as a mirror. A way to see the parts of you that are still asking for connection. And maybe, with enough awareness, you can begin to give yourself that connection too. To validate your own truth before asking someone else to. To say, this matters to me. I matter to me. And to let that be enough. Not because external validation isn't meaningful, but because when it becomes the only source of peace, the rehearsal never ends. You keep seeking the perfect response, the perfect tone, the perfect emotional posture, and you forget that sometimes, just existing in your truth, messy, unrehearsed, imperfect, is enough. That being misunderstood doesn't erase your meaning, that not everyone will get you, and that doesn't make you less worthy of being known. And when you begin to hold yourself with that kind of grace, the arguments in your mind start to soften. The need to be perfectly seen becomes less desperate, because you've already seen yourself, fully, kindly. And that kind of internal validation can be the beginning of real peace. I've noticed for me, it often starts with one sentence, something like, "They probably didn't mean it that way." But by the third or fourth mental loop, I'm nowhere near that original thought. I'm arguing, explaining, replaying, and by then, I've already forgotten what triggered it. Catching it early is hard, but when I do, I can actually talk myself down instead of just going for the ride. There's something oddly invisible about the moment a mental spiral begins. It doesn't always arrive with fanfare. There's rarely a loud announcement in the mind that says, "We're spiraling now." Instead, it often starts subtly. A stray thought, a passing emotional twinge, a flicker of memory that we didn't consciously summon but that suddenly takes root. Maybe it's the way someone looked at you, or the sound of your name in a certain tone, or the way your chest tightened when you read a short message, too vague to explain, too sharp to ignore. And before you know it, you're in it. The loop, the spiral, the quiet storm that builds silently, thought by thought, until you're mentally miles from where you started. Noticing that spiral is one of the most quietly powerful things a person can learn to do, because often, we only notice it when we've already been swept away, when our stomachs are tight, our jaws clenched, our breath shallow, when we're trying to work, but our attention is splintered, when we can't sleep, but our minds won't stop drafting, rewording, replaying. When the body starts to echo the mind's distress, that's usually the signal. But by then, the spiral has already spun. The art of noticing early, truly noticing the moment the first thread is pulled, is subtle. But it's also liberating, because the sooner you can see it, the more gently you can respond. Not with suppression, not with shame, but with acknowledgement, with awareness, with a kind voice that says, "Ah, I see you. This is one of those moments." It's the inner equivalent of stepping outside for fresh air before the room gets stuffy. It doesn't mean the thoughts stop, but it means they don't run unchecked. The mind, in its brilliance and sensitivity, often creates spirals as a way to process unresolved emotion. When something feels incomplete, a conversation, a fear, a possibility we didn't prepare for, the mind loops around it like hands warming a fragile thing. It's not malfunctioning, it's attempting mastery, safety, control. And when we don't realize we're spiraling, we often become fused with the content. We believe every thought is urgent, every possibility is real, every memory is as vivid and relevant as the present. We forget that we're observing the mind's theater. We think we're living it. But when we begin to see the spiral as it forms, not when it's fully grown, but when it's still soft, we can loosen our grip. We can watch instead of identify. We can pause before we're pulled. And that pause is sacred. It's not always easy. It requires self-trust, patience, a relationship with your own inner experience that doesn't rely on immediate control. And most of all, it requires safety, not from the outside world, but inside yourself. Because spirals are, at their core, signals of a perceived lack of safety. The mind is trying to prepare, prevent, explain, or control something that feels unsafe. So the antidote isn't force, it's care, curiosity, slowness. A moment of breath that interrupts the urgency. A softening gesture that reminds the body it's okay to stop running, even if just for a second. For me, the first sign of a spiral isn't a thought, it's a tension in my chest. Like my body knows before I do that something's grabbing hold. And if I can catch it early, I'll ask, what's this trying to protect me from? Just that question alone breaks the trance a little. It reminds me that the spiral isn't trying to ruin my day. It's trying to hold something it doesn't know how to process. And maybe that's true for most of us. The spiral is rarely random. It's often rooted in an unprocessed experience or emotion that hasn't been fully integrated. Maybe it's an old fear that found a new disguise. Maybe it's grief dressed up as anger. Maybe it's loneliness pretending to be productivity. Whatever it is, it wants attention. And the longer we ignore it, the louder it gets. But when we greet it with awareness, we begin to rewire the cycle. We stop rehearsing fear and start listening underneath it. What does this spiral want me to know? Not in a pressured way, but gently, with curiosity, with grace. The spiral isn't the problem. The lack of awareness around it is. Once we can name it, we can navigate it. Not with perfection, but with presence. And presence changes everything. Because presence is what spirals lack. They're fueled by past and future, by what was and what could be. But presence is what reminds us of what is. And what is, right now, might be uncomfortable, but it's also manageable, breathable, grounded. This shift from reactivity to noticing is not a one-time fix. It's a practice, a relationship, a skill that deepens over time. And like any relationship, it requires care, patience, repetition, forgiveness, because there will be times you notice the spiral too late, times you get swept up, times you forget everything you've learned. And that's okay. That's part of being human. What matters most is that at some point, whether early or late, you return. You come back to yourself. You recognize the spiral not as a failure, but as a signal, a signpost, a teacher. Right now, can you feel your breath? Just for a moment, gently notice. Not to fix, but to witness. This is what it means to notice the spiral. Not by thinking your way out, but by feeling your way through. By being honest about what's here. Maybe it's a knot in your stomach. Maybe it's a tightness in your shoulders. Maybe it's a racing loop of thoughts that won't slow down. Whatever it is, it makes sense. You make sense. And the more often you remind yourself of that, the less scary the spiral becomes. You begin to trust that even in the midst of mental noise, there is still a place in you that knows how to pause, that knows how to breathe, that remembers how to come home. I used to approach my thoughts like problems to solve. If I was spiraling, I wanted to fix it as quickly as possible, but that never worked. What helped was learning to sit with the thought and ask a softer question, like, what am I really afraid of here? That one shift, from control to curiosity, changed everything. When your mind starts to spiral, it's easy to fight it. That's often the first instinct. Clamp down, shut it off, drown it out. We throw distractions at it. We try to logic our way out. We tell ourselves we're being irrational, too sensitive, too much. But what if the spiral isn't a problem to solve, but a messenger to listen to? What if, instead of launching into an internal battle, you swapped the fighting for curiosity? This doesn't mean overanalyzing or obsessing even more. Curiosity isn't interrogation. It's soft, open-ended. It's the willingness to ask, what's this really about, without rushing to answer. It's pausing long enough to notice what emotion lives under the noise. Because often, the loop we get stuck in, the one that plays old conversations, replays mistakes, rehearses future conflicts, is guarding something tender underneath. A story we haven't fully told ourselves, a need we haven't acknowledged, a fear we haven't dared to name. The loop isn't always about the thing it's looping. That moment in the meeting, that awkward text reply, that one comment you keep replaying, those are surface-level cues, entry points. But if you drop beneath the words and stay with the feeling, there's almost always a deeper root. Curiosity is how you get there. And to be clear, curiosity doesn't mean liking the discomfort. It means meeting it with the same mindset you'd bring to a mystery, not knowing, but willing to find out. Not judging the spiral for showing up, but asking, why now? What is this part of me trying to do? Because even when your thoughts feel chaotic or repetitive, they often have a purpose. They're trying to protect, alert, soothe, warn. And while the strategy may be outdated or even exhausting, the intention behind it often makes sense. Curiosity lets you see that without collapsing into self-blame or shame. For a long time, I thought I had to choose between being kind to myself and being honest. Like I could only say, it's okay, you're doing your best, or this pattern isn't working anymore. But curiosity helped me realize those two things aren't opposites. They're partners. You can be gentle and clear. You can name the pattern and hold compassion for why it formed in the first place. And that shift, from inner courtroom to inner conversation, changed everything for me. It meant I could investigate my spirals without making them villains. I could sit with my discomfort without making it proof of failure. I could say, this makes sense, and still ask, is it still serving me? That question, is this still serving me, has become one of the most useful tools in my mental life, because it doesn't shame, it doesn't accuse, it just asks. And that leaves space for evolution. It honors the intelligence of the original pattern and the possibility of change. Curiosity also changes your relationship with discomfort. It doesn't make it disappear, but it gives you a different lens. Instead of trying to fix or banish every uncomfortable thought, you start to notice its shape, its texture, where it lands in your body. You ask it questions like, what are you afraid might happen? Or, what do you wish was different right now? These aren't questions that demand instant clarity. They're invitations. And sometimes, the answer doesn't come in words. Sometimes it comes in a sigh, a tear, a memory. Sometimes the answer is just the body relaxing a little because it realizes you're not going to attack it for being upset. You're not going to gaslight your own emotions. You're going to stay. You're going to listen. That's what curiosity does. It builds trust, not just in the moment, but in the long arc of your relationship with yourself. Over time, it becomes easier to move through spirals without fear. Not because they vanish, but because you know how to meet them. Curiosity also makes space for paradox. Sometimes you'll discover that you're angry and sad at the same time, that you feel both helpless and in control, that a part of you is done with something, and another part is still deeply attached. These aren't contradictions, they're layers, and curiosity knows how to hold them. It doesn't rush to simplify, it doesn't demand neatness, it just asks, what else is here? That question, that openness, can be deeply healing. Because so often, pain gets stuck when we try to confine it, when we try to box it into a single explanation. But pain, like people, is multifaceted, and when we bring curiosity, we make room for the full truth to emerge. Not just the first draft, not just the convenient version, the whole thing. That's how clarity comes, not from forcing answers, but from letting them unfold. Sometimes, what you'll find underneath the spiral isn't even about the present at all. It's about an old wound, triggered by something small. And curiosity helps you see that without panic, without collapsing into old stories. It gives you the emotional agility to say, this feels big because it reminds me of something else. That doesn't mean it is that old thing, but the resemblance is enough to stir the same emotions. That's a level of self-awareness that's both kind and powerful. It's the ability to witness your own reaction without shaming it, and without being consumed by it. Curiosity makes that possible. It's what allows you to stay connected to yourself, even when things feel messy or confusing. It's the tool that helps you differentiate between what's real and what's remembered, between what's current and what's historical, between what's happening now and what got reactivated. And all of this becomes especially important in moments of high emotional charge, moments where the instinct is to shut down or lash out. Curiosity offers a third path. It says, pause, notice, what's happening in me right now? And often, that's enough to create just a sliver of space, a breath, a beat, a moment of non-reactivity. And in that space, something new can emerge. A different response, a kinder word, a more honest truth. This doesn't mean becoming passive or disconnected. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about being more connected to yourself, to your emotions, to the reality of what you need. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. The spiral shows up, the thoughts race, and instead of panicking, you say, "Okay, I see you. Let's slow down. What's this really about?" That moment of gentle inquiry becomes a turning point, not because it fixes everything, but because it shifts the energy. It turns conflict into conversation. It replaces resistance with respect. It opens a door where there used to be a wall. Curiosity also helps you build resilience, because when you approach your own mind with openness instead of fear, you stop being afraid of yourself. You stop seeing your inner world as a battlefield and start seeing it as a landscape to explore. Some parts will be stormy, some will be calm, some will be unfamiliar, but all of it belongs. All of it deserves attention, and with attention comes understanding. With understanding comes choice, and with choice comes freedom. That's the quiet power of curiosity. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand, it just stays, and in staying, it transforms. Letting go isn't always about forgiveness. It isn't always about resolution or final words or someone seeing your side. Often, it's simply about deciding not to carry something anymore. Not because it wasn't heavy, not because it didn't matter, but because it's too costly to keep holding. Emotional closure isn't always earned through conversations or understanding or apologies. Sometimes it's self-given. Sometimes the closure you need is permission to stop hoping the past will change. We spend so much time trying to resolve what can't be resolved, replaying old arguments, rewriting old messages in our minds, rehearsing imaginary versions of events where we finally win, where the other person finally understands, finally admits they were wrong, finally offers the apology we deserved. But more often than not, that moment never comes, and the pain of waiting for it becomes its own prison. Letting go is the quiet act of unlocking that door, not because justice was served, but because you're tired of holding your breath. It's the moment you realize your peace matters more than your case, that your life needs your presence more than your past needs defending. Letting go doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It means not letting that hurt define the shape of your days. It means carrying the scar without reopening the wound. It's not denial, it's choice. A deliberate choice to stop feeding energy into what no longer returns it. And often it begins with a single sentence. I can want closure and still move on without it. That sentence isn't defeat, it's freedom, because it acknowledges reality, that not every story wraps up neatly, that not every injustice gets fixed, that not everyone who hurt you will understand they did. And waiting for that understanding can drain you, day by day, like a silent leak in your emotional reserves. Letting go is how you patch that leak. It's not a one-time decision. It's a practice, a posture, a quiet re-choosing every time the memory resurfaces, every time the urge to re-engage arises. It's saying, yes, I still wish it were different, but I'm no longer anchoring my life to that wish. I used to think that if I let something go, it meant I was saying it didn't matter, that it wasn't worth the pain. But over time, I learned that letting go is often the most honest thing you can do. It says, this mattered so much, I can't let it keep hurting me anymore. It took me years to realize that I didn't need to win the argument in my head to be at peace. I didn't need the last word. I needed rest. And the moment I stopped trying to win, I started to heal. Letting go is hard because it often means releasing something before you feel ready. The mind clings to what's unresolved. It wants symmetry. It wants stories that make sense. It wants a villain, a hero, a satisfying conclusion. But life rarely offers that. Sometimes you don't get the clarity. Sometimes the person who hurt you doesn't apologize. Sometimes you're the one who made the mistake, and the guilt sticks like glue. Letting go in those moments is a radical act. It's saying, even without answers, I choose forward. It's not clean, it's not easy, but it's sacred, because it honors your future over your fixation, and it lets you redirect that energy from mental loops to meaningful living. It also helps to understand that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean condoning. It means loosening your emotional grip. It means stepping back far enough to see that clinging to the wound has started to wound you. It means asking, what is this costing me? And being brave enough to answer. Because the truth is, holding on often feels powerful, like armor. Like if you just stay angry enough, guarded enough, right enough, you'll be safe. But in reality, it's a heavy burden. It takes up space where joy could live. It dims your ability to be present, to trust, to feel wonder. Letting go, paradoxically, is strength. It's not letting someone off the hook. It's letting yourself off the hook of needing to keep score. And scorekeeping is exhausting. Letting go is release, not of memory, but of maintenance. One of the myths about closure is that it comes from the other person, from a conversation, a shared understanding. And yes, sometimes that happens. But more often, closure is self-created. It's a moment of internal alignment where you stop waiting for someone else to validate your experience. You validate it yourself. You say, this happened, it hurt, it changed me, and I'm allowed to keep going. You build closure from honesty, from naming what was real, from grieving what didn't unfold how you hoped, from forgiving yourself for not seeing it sooner, from realizing that you don't need to rehearse the pain to honor the truth of it. Sometimes closure is simply the absence of the need to revisit, the absence of urgency, the absence of mental turbulence around the memory. And when that begins to settle, when the charge starts to fade, you'll know you're starting to let go. Letting go also means making peace with the fact that you may never fully understand what happened. That some people won't explain their choices, that some chapters won't have clarity. And still, your life is allowed to continue. Still, your heart is allowed to open. Still, you are worthy of peace. We sometimes tether our worth to resolution, as if only once things are resolved can we be okay. But letting go breaks that chain. It says, I am okay now, even with the unknown, even with the loose ends. That's a powerful reframe, because it places your healing back in your hands. And from there, you can start to build again. Not from the rubble of the old story, but from the truth of your new chapter. This doesn't mean the pain disappears. Some hurts linger. Some wounds reopen from time to time. But even then, letting go helps. Because you're not picking at the wound. You're tending to it. You're allowing yourself to feel, but not to drown. You're learning the difference between honoring the past and being held hostage by it. Letting go is the practice of that distinction. And like all practices, it gets stronger with time. At first, it might feel like failure, like giving up. But it's not. It's surrender. Not to the hurt, but to healing. Not to the other person, but to yourself. In relationships, Letting go often shows up when you realize that the other person isn't going to be who you hoped they'd be. That you can't force someone to understand, to grow, to see what you see. And trying to make them do so will only exhaust you. Letting go is the quiet acceptance that change may never come from them, but it can come from you. You can step out of the dynamic. You can stop rehearsing your worth to someone who isn't listening. You can say, even if you never understand what you did, I understand what I need. That's closure. That's strength. Letting go is also deeply connected to self-trust, because the act of releasing often stirs up fear. Fear that it'll happen again. Fear that you're being naive. Fear that moving on means inviting more pain. But letting go says, I trust myself to handle what comes next. It's not blind hope. It's rooted confidence. It's saying, I've lived through hard things before. I've grieved. I've grown. I can do it again. That trust becomes a foundation. And from there, you stop needing to guard every memory like evidence. You stop needing to make sense of every detail. You stop needing the story to end your way. Because you've found a deeper sense of direction. One that doesn't require winning to move on. And finally, letting go is an act of love. Love for your energy. Love for your sanity. Love for the life you still get to live. It's not passive. It's powerful. It's the moment you step out of the story that hurt you and start writing something new. Not because the past was okay, but because the future deserves your full attention. And so, if your mind still replays those old conversations, if it still writes new ones you'll never have, know that you're not broken. You're human, sensitive, attuned. Often, the mind rehearses not to win, but to soothe, to process, to prepare. But eventually, we learn that we don't always need to finish the loop to feel at peace. We can notice it, soften toward it, and gently return to ourselves. Maybe we'll never find the perfect line. Maybe the closure won't come from the other person. But we can still choose peace. We can still choose rest. Even with the story unfinished. Even with the past unedited. Even if the argument never happens. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. If this helped you feel a little more understood, a little more at ease, I hope you'll come back next week. Until then, may your thoughts quiet down like a shoreline after waves. May your heart feel steady, and may your sleep come gently. Good night.